glad everybody in the room can hear me tonight. So, good evening. As Diane said, Kevin Chatellier with the City of Virginia Beach. I think come and spoke to this group this time of the year for the last, during the pandemic. I recall doing it remotely while the group was meeting in a restaurant.
Mom's Kitchen.
That's
Yep,
right.
you were on that.
And so I certainly I'm familiar with the group, and so I'm sure there's a mounted thing of questions. So I'm going to try to work through the information fairly quickly. It's an engaged group that I'm sure everybody watched the budget presentation, has been watching city council meetings. So I'll try to work through this quickly and try to save room for questions and answers.
Hold the microphone closer to your mouth.
Is that better?
Yeah.
All right.
Much better.
Good to know. Okay, so hope everybody heard everything I said. I'm going to try to get to it so we can save time. And as everybody already acknowledged, Councilmember Cummings is in attendance as well. So I'll certainly be able to take any feedback questions, and if I can't get those or answer it tonight, then I'll respond to the group as best I can with the information in a timely manner. I promise. All right. So the organization of the presentation was really organized in this manner here. So direction from City Council, I'll quickly cover that. Operating budget overview, capital improvement program overview, as well as brief discussion of schools. We'll get into a little bit of the revenue discussion. As Diane said, I'll include a timetable of the next public meetings and presentations and when they're going to be to City Council, so the group can certainly make their voice heard and come out and just give City Council their feedback and input on the proposed city manager's operating budget. So the operating budget is really a year-round process. I know that people typically hear that and they think, okay, well, yeah, we hear about it occasionally, but as budget management services staff, my staff can tell you, we're constantly taking feedback and input and collecting information and gathering what we hear from City Council and the public throughout the year to develop the proposed city manager's operating budget. So the proposed operating budget, in fact, began with information and direction provided by City Council during the reconciliation process that happened about this time last year in the adoption of the current year operating budget. Direction was given to make priority to fund an additional 30 firefighters. There was a request for 60, an identified need for 60. Funding limitation resources we couldn't fund all 60 in the current year, so it was a phased approach. 30 was added in the current year with direction to try to add another 30 in the proposed FY26 operating budget. Additional direction was given to try to prioritize and annualize the cost of the expansion of the Parks After Dark program to College Park and Level Green Park within the city. There was also direction specifically given in the reconciliation letter at City Council wanted additional feedback and information and knowledge and to get smart on a few key topics so they could make more informed decisions related to the FY26 operating budget. For example, the EMS sustainability plan, there's concerns about the long-term sustainability, declining donations to the volunteer rescue squads, and the need to identify a long-term sustainable bill payer and funding source for that. So directions given to conduct a study there. The tax and fee diversification, that's something my office or my department put together a report and provided that information to City Council. The ITA feasibility study, City Council requested information of what some options could look like to potentially develop out the ITA area here related to greenery, open space, parks and recreational amenities. Market salary survey was a big operating budget component in the development of FY26 operating budget. Direction was provided by City Council to conduct a market salary survey, which was reported out in January of this year. And I'll February, and I'll be able to speak more to that a little bit. And also something else City Council has been very mindful of is the sustainability of the Town Center Special Service District Fund, and that's the primary bill payer for maintenance efforts and maintenance of the garages within the Town Center area of the city. It's an additional surcharge that residents and businesses within that district pay of 45 cents per 100 assessed value, and that's intended to maintain and keep up the enhanced services within the town center district. So I'll get to this a little bit later. City Council also made it a very particular a top priority issue to talk about the CIP at their annual retreat that occurred over the winter. So they provided a lot of good feedback and direction, which was really a driving factor in Monumental in how the proposed CIP was put together and the direction and guidance and input that was received and the thought that went into putting it together. So I'll speak to that more in a little bit. But first, talk about the operating budget. So in total, the operating budget is $2.78 billion. You can see broken down here at the bottom of this slide. That's combined city schools. In terms of FTEs, city FTEs is 7,738, and total for schools is 10,669. So looking at the pie chart here, you can see that education is the largest component of the total combined operating budget, making up about 44% of it. So new, last year at this point in time, public safety, the public infrastructure departments such as public works, public utilities, and planning were the second largest portion of the pie. However, this year it's public safety. So that's police, fire, EMS. You can see here that that's the second largest investment in the city's operating budget at 13.6%. So one of the things that I've talked about, and I certainly know that this group's familiar with, is concept of buying power and constant dollar. So historically, whenever we've reflected inflation, we've shown it as it changed in time, a year over year or a month to month change in time. So you might see 3% inflation on this scale and then 1%. And it gives us perception of, well, inflation's gone down. That's true, but that previous 3% is still there. It's a compounding measure. Everybody knows that. You go buy a gallon of milk, it's not 50 cents anymore, it's $4, right? So, you know, it's inflation. Everything goes up and it's cumulative. So what this graph here does is it reflects the operating budget, the city's annual operating budget as adopted, and that's represented by the blue bar there, or the blue line. So you can see back in 2018, it was $1.97 billion. The proposed operating budget following that blue line up is $2.785 billion. So it certainly shows year-over-year growth. What the orange line represents is whenever that's been controlled for inflation. So going back to the 2018 timeframe, putting it in 2018 dollars, you can see that it's really shown little growth over that period of time in terms of actual true growth, which is quite remarkable. Because whenever you think about all the additional enhancements and then services that have been absorbed over the previous years since 2018, for example, I think we've added 115 firefighters. We've added certainly 58 or more EMS staff positions, opened 2 fire stations, Burton Station, and expanded to the 4th story. So there's really been a lot of expansion and investment, but the city's been able to absorb that without reflecting actually too much true growth in the operating budget. So previously on that slide, and I didn't highlight this, there's 3 X marks here, or 3 points in time. Those are points in time when the real estate policy decisions were made regarding the real estate tax rate, either to reduce it or to absorb the bond referendum, the flood protection bond referendum amount, as opposed to raising the real estate tax rate. So what this does is do a little bit deeper dive in that and how the mechanics of that worked. So going back to 2021, the real estate tax rate was $1.175 of a cent, I believe. And so it's actually just for this 101.75 pennies. You can think of it that way. So that was the real estate tax rate, but there's dedications that occur within that, right? So the Parks and Rec Special Revenue Fund, which funds all the rec centers and the maintenance efforts within those rec centers, as well as the original construction of those rec centers, that receives a dedication of 3.476 cents. The ARP, the Agricultural Reserve Program, receives a dedication of 0.9. The Outdoor Initiative, 0.47. At that point in time, in 2018, 21, there was a 2.5 cent stormwater dedication of the real estate tax rate, with the total, the residual retained by the general fund of 94.4 cents. So that's where all the funds that shared in the base tax rate of 101.75 cents. In 2022, it was reduced by 2.75 cents. So following it across, you can see the real estate tax rate is 99 cents, with the dedications retaining their portion of the real estate tax, and the reduction occurred within the general fund, with the general fund retaining 91.65. In 23, the same thing. You'll notice that the real estate tax rate remained the same. The dedications remain the same, with a new one established of 4.1 cents. That's the dedication related with the flood protection program, in which City Council made the decision, as opposed, even though the referendum was approved, as opposed to raising the real estate tax rate, City Council made the decision to absorb that through the assessment growth that occurred that year. And so the dedication was established, with that fund being put in place as a sustainable bill payer. The stormwater operations retained its portion of the 2.5 cents, and the reduction of that 4.1 cent came from the general fund, with the general fund being retaining 87.55 cents. Fast forward to the current year, in which the real estate tax rate was reduced by 2 cents. The same thing occurred, in which the dedications were held harmless, with the general fund reducing its portion of what it retained from the real estate tax to only retaining 85.55. So the general fund is the primary bill payer of what people think of the core government services, right? So police, fire, EMS, finance, internal departments, that's the bill payer for those type of departments. So in total, over this period of time, the real estate tax rate reduction that occurred in the general fund was 8.85 cents, or close to 72 million. We typically talk about, whenever we're developing the operating budget drivers. So I'm not going to bore everybody with all of these, and I'm not going to talk about them one by one, because I know there's questions over there waiting that I'm probably not getting to, but I do want to talk about a couple of them. In particular, some of the bigger drivers, and I have it as like a little star up here, asterisk, as something that we're being very mindful of and monitoring going forward, and it's likely going to be a key budget driver. Tax relief programs offered by the City of Virginia Beach. There's two primarily related to the real estate tax rate, or real estate taxes. The first being the Veterans Tax Relief. So this is the mandated program put in place. It's actually part of the state constitution now, as it was approved by voters on the referendum, in which disabled veterans don't pay, or the city can't charge or bill them for real estate taxes. So what occurs is a veteran will go to the Veteran Affairs, and if they are determined to be disabled by the Veteran Affairs, 100% disabled, then they bring the certificate and they then qualify the city. They go to the Commissioner of Revenue, it gets in the land book, and then the property that that individual owns is not billed or does not remit real estate taxes to the city. So again, it's a mandated program in which the city doesn't have any control over, but it's certainly growing at a concerning rate. So in FY26, the amount of that exemption is $36 million, equal to 4.4 cents of the real estate tax rate. So the growth of this program, it's not just as a result of assessment growth of those properties, it's enrollment. So the program's grown by about 28% a year. So the increase between the current year and next year is about $8.4 million. So for context of that, each penny of the real estate tax rate generates $8.2 million. So if this were to continue growing at that rate, you could actually think of it in this manner. You could think of it if it's growing at that rate, then the following year the general fund's allocation, or what it could actually retain from the base, would be 84 cents, 83 cents, because it's just being exempted off of the land book value. So that's one of them. The other is the Elderly and Disabled Tax Relief Program offered within the City of Virginia Beach. It's a long-standing program offered by the city. It's a local option, meaning it's not mandated. City council has discretion and flexibility in the parameters of the program. And there are parameters. An individual needs to be, if it's age-driven, the individual needs to be 65. The individual needs to have income below a certain threshold, and the assets of the individual, excluding the home value, are not to exceed $350,000. Virginia Beach's policy, we have to benchmark it every 3 years. It offers the best benefit within the Hampton Roads localities in terms of the offerings of the program, in terms of the income thresholds being the highest, the property values not having a cap or a limitation on them. So it's a very good policy and generous policy the city has in place. The total amount being exempted from that in FY26 is $15.6 million, or that's equivalent to 1.9 cents of the real estate tax rate. There is a policy in place in which every year the rates are to be adjusted up based on the median home, the percentage increase of a median home, single-family home within the city of Virginia Beach. So, for example, the tax freeze program, as proposed under this, the income threshold will now be $108,075, meaning that if an individual makes less than $108,075, they meet the age requirement, have less than $350,000 net assets, then they can qualify for this and not pay $1 more in real estate taxes than what they paid the previous year, which would allow them to not be priced out of their home. We typically think about budget drivers. One of the things we're, as a top priority of the city, long has been, and certainly city council, is public safety. So just a few things worth noting on this. Within the police department, there is the inclusion of the implementation of a speed camera enforcement program. So within the general fund operating budget, the amount retained is the amount needed to add additional part-time police officers who will be responsible for reviewing the video footage. And then the residual amount is to be directed to the CIP, or the Capital Improvement Program, for the purpose of traffic safety improvements and enhancements. So that's in the neighborhood of about $4 million a year being directed to that CIP project, or estimated to be. Something else worth noting is the proposed budget includes an ordinance to establish a compassionate billing system for the Department of Emergency Medical Services. It's estimated this will generate about $14 million a year. For transparency, that is included in its own standalone special revenue fund. So it's a special revenue fund estimating $14 million with some EMS operations included within that, but also other line items that's in alignment with an agreement to be established with the city and the volunteer rescue squads, and an allocation model to share those revenues generated through the compassionate billing system. So for the Department of EMS, this allowed the establishment of an additional 33.5 FTEs, the establishment of a sustainable equipment replacement plan, and then for my understanding the first time, all of the volunteer rescue squads are all in agreement in that this is the best path forward to establish a sustainable, reliable system, EMS system, in the city's continued partnership with the volunteer rescue squads. I know this group is certainly familiar with the city's practice and the city's long history with the volunteer rescue squads. My dad, whenever he comes out here, he was shocked to find out that a city of our size had a volunteer rescue squad, and that a trip to a hospital would cost nothing, zero. It was all being done by volunteers, and the city's contribution to those volunteers, historically, the volunteer organizations has historically been little to nothing, as they were self-sufficient, and their primary bill payer was donations collected and fundraiser events. It allowed them to sustain their operations for a long time. However, post-pandemic reality is those donations have declined, volunteerism has declined, and so the city's in this transition to needing to find a sustainable future for the current system that we have in place. and the city and the volunteer rescue squads both believe that this is best practice going forward. So something I was asked earlier today, well, what does the compassionate billing mean? So the compassionate billing is best described by the EMS chief last Tuesday at City Council, where it's this system of where it's not to actively try to pursue, collect, or burden anybody that has a financial burden. It's intended to bill the insurance companies of the individuals that have insurance and receive some form of reimbursement from the insurance companies for the services rendered to that individual. So it's really intended to have no impact or zero impact on out-of-pocket expenses for Virginia Beach residents. I'm going to move through a little bit. Keeping the lights on, and I'll just quickly cover this. So it's just a category. There's just some things that the city does that individuals don't necessarily think about as being a budget driver. But us being in the budget department, we certainly see these, and we know the impacts of inflation are real. So just a couple that are on here. Within the city garage, so the city has an internal service fund, our city garage, where we have people, staff on call that if a fire engine breaks down in the middle of the night, somebody comes in and they go respond, report, fix the hose, whatever they need to do, and they get the apparatus back going again. So inclement weather, the city has its own city garage and the staff, and they also have a need of a parts contract, which is tied to inflation, right? So each year, whenever we hear about the cost of goods, materials, imported goods going up, the city's not exempt from that. City Garage is also seeing that as well, with those parts going up in cost, meaning the more that they need to pay and the less they can do in other areas of their operations. So that's just one thing. And then the other thing, sorry if anybody in here is in the IT world, but I'm just convinced that IT is a racket. You have, sorry, you have the contracts. So you've got Microsoft contracts, Adobe licensing for computers and operations, and it's so integral and such a part of the everyday operations. Well, the city doesn't get those for free. Those two are tied to subscription agreements and cost increases. So those are impacted by CPI and the cost of inflation. Those have escalators in them as well. So there's some of these baseline things where costs go up, and it's critical to allocate the resources to keep them going. Workforce compensation certainly considered a budget driver. And so I mentioned earlier there was the market salary survey that was conducted with the direction given by City Council to conduct it. The report out occurred in January, and there was two options to be explored. One was what would it look like to identify and bring the positions identified as being out of below the market up to 95% of the market, meaning they're not leading the market, but they're within 95%, within 5% of the market. The results that came back from the consultant was that that would cover 48% of the workforce to get them up to the 95% of the market with an estimated cost of $32 million, meaning that that's 48 to implement. 48% of the workforce would receive an adjustment, the other 52% would not receive an adjustment. Option two was to explore what would it look like if Virginia Beach wanted to be a leader in the market, wanted to be at the top of the market in terms of the other localities in the surrounding area. So that benchmark was done as well, and the consultant determined that it would cover 76% of the workforce to get to be leading the market with an estimated cost of $70.8 million. Understanding that's a lot of resources, and that is not in the normal estimated growth of the revenues. There was not enough resources to implement the option two, as well as the pinch in limited resources generated with attempting to try to implement option one. So the proposed budget has allocated an additional $34 million for compensation adjustments to the city's workforce. With the direction of City Council, the priority for the market implementation was to be for public safety sworn officers as well as those identified as the lowest in out of compliance of the market. So for example, janitorial positions that aren't even, their pay range isn't even up to the city's minimum of 15 for some of the other positions. So it would make some minor adjustments to those type scales. Keeping in mind that pinch of we were only able to find and allocate $34 million for that, that's not going to cover the implementation and bring everybody up to market. That was $32 million alone. So that would have been allocating the full compensation reserve for only 48% of the workforce. So unfortunately, there was a need to find a compromise, and so the public safety and those out of the market were to get the market adjustment. A step increase is to be provided for public safety, with the remainder of the workforce to receive a 3% general increase. Not a step increase, but a general increase. And the thinking here is by moving the full pay range of those individuals, one, they won't fall further behind in the market. They'll at least keep up with inflation or 3%, but it'll also extend the range, increasing our long-term earning potential. So it's certainly a compromise, as resources are just not available to do it all. Following up with the direction to make an effort to look at exploring diversification of some revenue streams, there are proposed some various fee adjustments included to maintain operations in a sustainable manner. So for example, I've mentioned the EMS compassionate billing, the planning department. There's a proposed adjustment to the short-term rental fee, the annual application, from $200 to $500, and from $200 to $500. And that will allow an increase of additional 3 FTEs to the planning department for continued implementation and improvement of the implementation, exploratory, and ensuring that short-term rental applicants remain in compliance. Something else worth noting is the stormwater ERU. So City Council received a briefing earlier in the year with a rating agency, or not rating agency, a rate consultant, identified a need for the Stormwater Enterprise Fund to receive an increase or increase the equivalent residential unit, or the ERU, to maintain operations as they currently exist. The proposed budget includes an increase of 8.9 cents in the daily ERU rate, which equates to $2.70 per month, or $32 per year. Everybody will likely recall that it was a direction by City Council upon approval of the bond referendum and the flood protection program to freeze the ERU rate at its current rate through FY29. So the same exercise that I went through for the total operating budget really helps to kind of tell the story of the impact inflation's having on the stormwater enterprise fund. So going back to 2018, so this is the Stormwater Enterprise Fund. Keeping in mind the orange line is the adopted annual budget. The gray line here, or the tan line, is the one that's been adjusted for inflation. The last time the ERU was increased was 2020. You can see whenever the rate was frozen, right here, the fund was in a very different situation. Post-pandemic, the level of inflation that the ERU, or the stormwater fund's been experiencing with contracts and everything, it's really reduced its purchasing and buying power. And so they're headed in a path to where they're going to likely start scaling back services due to cost increases in some of their other services that they're providing. So the rate adjustment will allow them to at least catch back up to where they were previously in FY21 in terms of real buying power dollars. And the total proposed budget includes the Stormwater Enterprise Fund at $57.5 million. I'm not going to bore everybody with all the FTEs. Just so everybody knows, the city manager is very big on not adding FTEs without there being a bill payer to offset it somewhere within the operating budget. So bills up here in the light blue have an identified bill payer associated with them. I mentioned the EMS, compassionate billing, public works, VDOT revenues provided by the state for maintenance medians and the roadways, allow them to add additional FTEs for concrete sidewalk crews. In the general fund ad, there were very few that were added that didn't have a bill payer. With the fire, that was certainly the direction of City Council. But within Public Works, Police, and Human Services, there were FTE adds. So these were the result of identified needs. Some of these things you just don't think about, right? So within Human Services, I know this group's thinking, why would you add an FTE whenever Human Services has so many vacant FTEs? Well, there's some nuances that you just don't actually think about. So whenever you're operating a juvenile detention center, there's a need for redundancy in FTEs. If you have underage males and underage females, you can't just slot a male to provide the same level of coverage and service for both. You actually need a male and a female to maintain those ratios. There's a lot of balance in some of these things that you just don't think about from a high level until you get down and look at the operation and understand the need. But those positions that were added, there were offsets elsewhere in the operating budget. So for example, the city manager's office cut a position. The Department of Performance Measurement, they eliminated a position. There were positions that were eliminated to offset those ads. So the CIP, I'm going to quickly move through the CIP. It's been a long conversation. Inflation certainly had a heavy toll on the cost of some of the CIP projects that we're seeing. Inflation, or the producer price index, since 2018 has grown faster than CPI on all goods and services. So this one's nearly resulted in the cost of projects doubling since 2018. And so some examples this group might be familiar with are the need for mid-year plus-ups for Shore Drive 3, Elbow 2, and Winston-Salem, where even though additional resources were added during the budget process, whenever the projects went out to bid in the market said, no, the project's going to cost more than that. And to get them the contract awarded, there was a need to go back and make adjustments to those. So the direction the City Council gave at the winter retreat related to the CIP, and I quickly went over this slide earlier. It's listed here, and I've structured the next slides regarding or related to the CIP in an effort of trying to talk about each one of these points. So one of the things City Council said to do was to look at potentially delaying, deleting, or right-sizing the scope of some projects. So the proposed budget certainly does that, and recommending the deletion of these 4 projects, the delaying exploration to potentially rescope these 4 projects here, and in doing that, local funding capacity from this created and freed up allowed the full funding of Cleveland Street 4, as well as Independence Boulevard, Pleasure House Road. The remaining capacity that was freed up from delaying, deferring, or scaling back those projects was preserved for future debt capacity for the City Council's allocation and prioritization use. Debt service and debt metrics, we're always very mindful of that. The reason that the orange box here is outlined is this is the point in time where we're going to, over the next 6 years, be at our higher end of our self-imposed debt metrics. The market has determined that this is the most important of all the debt service, all the debt metrics, being debt service as a percentage of your annual operating budget. And out there in those years, that's the last issuance anticipated related to the flood protection program and the bond referendum. So we're being very mindful of those. You can see even with the full issuance of those, we're anticipated to be under the 10% threshold, but there's always a need to maintain that flexibility for the unforeseen should something happen. Dedication, City Council gave direction to explore the potential redirection of dedications that have capacity with the intent of maintaining, or with direction to maintain the original intent which the dedication was established. So the proposed budget does that. The 3 that a redirect occurs from is the Open Space Fund, the Town Center TIF, and the Agricultural Reserve Program. The redirection from these 3 dedications will allow the dedications to continue as they're currently established. So for example, within the Agricultural Reserve Program, the remaining dedication in place will still allow the acquisition of 300 acres a year in development rights within, for those qualifying properties that are agriculture. It'll allow the city to maintain and continue to pay the existing debt obligations for properties already enrolled within the program, and flexibility to adapt should additional properties come online faster than the 300 acres a year. Between these 3, the proposed budget was able to redirect $11.8 million, and I'll get to where that was dedicated to in a second, but that is a dedication that could remain in place and would act as a sustainable bill payer for years to come for capital projects. So I tried taking all of this and putting it in a visual to help try to talk about the timeline. So this is a 6-year reflection of the CIP, a timeline going across. And so if you can visualize this blue box here, as we were being mindful of the debt, right? So that orange is the peak point in time in which the debt metrics are going to be increasing related to the flood protection program. So we were mindful not to add a whole bunch of debt or program bonds in the early years of the CIP. So this is representative of the cash funding program being programmed in the CIP. In particular, 4 projects came out, 3 in particular came out of priority projects of City Council's conversation at the winter retreat. The LEDA, phrase need a LEDA, Law Enforcement Training Academy is what that stands for. The current facility is a old school off of Bird Neck Road, and it's in need of renovation, refurbishment, and the fire and police department and their training needs have outgrown the existing facility. So programmed in the CIP is $8.7 million in cash funding in the early years of the CIP to get design underway for that. Another project identified as a priority or in need is the Indian River Road Safety Improvement Project down in the southern part of the city. Design program for that's $9.2 million. There's been a gap identified on the VB Trail project above the state and federal funding that's allocated to the project. $16 million will allow the project to get fully funded and awarded now for construction. And then another need that's certainly been of more recent conversation is a courthouse modernization, or might be retitled to another project. That was the study that went underway, but there's ADA compliant issues, safety issues and concern, and the judges are certainly being very communicative about that and letting the public know of their concerns and needs within the facility. And that's going to be a very costly project that was not on the radar screen a few years back, but it could be something that the city has to do in the near future if it becomes a judge's order. So keeping in mind this is a cash mechanism. And then I'll move over here. In the out years, the dedication that I'm talking about and being able to put in place the establishment of a major project fund will allow, once the design for those is done and there's a better sense of what the overall construction project costs are going to be and the needs are, then conversations can occur about potentially programming bonds to actually construct the facilities. So it's estimated that the residual for the LEDA would be $83 million. The need for Indian River Road Safety Improvement, $130 million, including the bridge. And then the courthouse, $170 million. Of course, this is proposed with discussions to take place, but this capacity could be for, if City Council were to make a decision, other projects are higher priority. So for example, the Coastal Resiliency Project, a study underway with the Army Corps, the aquarium existing facility, future phases of VB Trail, 911 backup center. So it's just intended to establish a mechanism and a potential sustainable bill payer. So what are the mechanisms that make up this major project fund? So the 3 sources I previously talked about from the redirect of real estate from the ARP, the real estate from the TIF, the meals tax, open space dedication, And then the residual needed to sustainably fund the four previously noted projects is a meals tax adjustment or an increase of 0.5% or 0.5%. So that would result in Virginia Beach having a meals tax rate of 6%, which would tie Chesapeake as the lowest in the Hampton Roads region. And that meals tax increase, that 0.5%, that generates about $9.2 million a year, which is roughly right in line with the amount needed to sustainably debt finance a $92 million law enforcement training academy. In total, that will allow a sustainable dedication to occur within the major projects fund of $21 million and grow in future years with the organic growth of those revenue streams. So this is small print for those in the back of the room. I apologize for that. I'm not going to relive all this again. I do just want to make note of a couple of these in terms of the allocation of cash in the early years of the CIP. One of the things that we're seeing is a need for fire trucks. The pandemic was a very challenging time in chip shortages and supply chain issues. And so what was occurring is fire trucks were being purchased based on what was available, whatever they could get their hands on, right? And so now what we're seeing is there's other needs with some of the apparatus they haven't been able to get their hands on. Historically programmed in the CIP's fire apparatus replacement project of about $2.4 million a year. So that used to get 3 trucks a year. Now it will barely get a ladder truck. And the cost of the apparatus have increased so much. So included in the proposed budget is an additional $7 million programmed in year 1. After a review from Public Works, the City Garage, and conversations with Fire, this is the starting point to get the fleet back on a routine schedule replacement cycle, avoiding service interruption, breaking down of fire apparatus rigs, and what's resulting in now is the trickle through, right? So they're keeping the existing rigs longer because they can't get the new ones because they don't have enough resources for it. Public Works is then having to maintain the old ones at a longer point in time, costing them more, chewing up more staff time or more shop time, creating them not being able to get to, sorry, I'll stop preventing them to be able to get to police cruisers and other things in the city garage also in need of maintenance. So it's certainly a step in the right direction of trying to get the fire apparatus back on track. This one, you'll notice it's all blue, indicating this is a cash thing all the way through the CIP. So the coastal section is a section of the CIP where it's not a good idea to debt finance, right? You don't want to be in the routine of debt financing sand replenishment. You know, issuing bonds to pay on 20 years worth of sand for it to wash away within 2 years. It's just not a good financial practice. So historically, it's a cash funded section of the CIP. One of the things included in the proposed budget is the implementation of a personal property boat tax at $1.50 per 100 assessed value. So this is in line with the currently existing commercial boat rate. And it's in line with, I think, Portsmouth's tax rate within the region. Virginia Beach is one of the only locality that doesn't charge anything for boats. In terms of the personal property tax rate, 2 others don't. Norfolk and Hampton do not. However, they do charge boat license fees similar to what the old automobile license decal stickers were. They have a process that they use for that for the registration of boats. So through that $1.50 personal property tax request or implementation of that tax increase, so that would be on vessels that are 18 feet and larger. So the notion here in trying to follow the sequence and direction of council, being mindful of program users and user fees, the real need driven to dredge the deeper water channels is by the larger boats that draw more water. So the thought is state code will allow for that bifurcation to occur of the 18-foot in length for the tax to apply on those larger and a different tax rate to apply on those smaller. So the proposed budget is for the $1.50 to be applied on vessels 18 feet and larger. That'll generate $4.3 million a year, which is dedicated and reflected in the coastal section under the coastal section. Oh, computer's saying get off the stage. So to give some numbers and sense to that, I mentioned that the CIP, this section of the CIP is cash funded. So this is a sense, think about it, 6-year programming. So FY23 budget, 24-25. The total 6-year general fund support within the coastal section has averaged $48.2 million of cash between fund balance and pay-go. The proposed budget, the 6-year general fund allocation to the coastal section is $24.7 million, with the proposed boat tax to cover $25.9. So in total cash, $50.6 million. So what did the redirected capacity allow? It allowed us to start planning for the fire apparatus, to the other cash needs that are coming, forthcoming in the CIP. Another good example of one that we know is on the radar, but it's not needed yet, is likely a $10 million plus up within the next 3 to 4 years for, I call it scuba gear, but it's the fire breathing apparatus equipment. It's very technical in nature, IT's involved in it, it syncs up with a whole lot of the other equipment, and so the comprehensive replacement of that is estimated to be around $10 million. Again, technology is a better utilization of cash as opposed to debt financing, so it's likely a lot of cash needs coming, and also going to be a squeeze on it in terms of the operating budget. Just for context, here's the elementary school looking pie chart for the CIP. Just the good visual of this is that those can see that stormwater and flood protection still remain the #1 priority, and largest allocation of resources to the CIP at 23%. Public schools, just going to quickly cover this, as I think this is a changing dynamic. Schools are proposing a 3.5% on average compensation adjustment for their staff, although I think there is conversations occurring as to the prioritization of potentially additional state revenue coming to the schools. Also worth noting, this is the first time that we can see that schools have utilized attrition savings in the balancing of their operating budget, about $11.8 million. Skipping down to the CIP, schools have a robust CIP. There's a lot of funding allocations that they have and programmed in their maintenance projects. And so there was a conversation that occurred at a joint city school joint modernization committee meeting. City representatives from city council, liaisons from the school board, and city staff got together and discussed the initially proposed superintendent estimate of needs CIP. They initially came with a recommendation of Princess Anne High School to be programmed within the existing 6-year CIP, I believe at $315 million-ish. You remember the debt metrics that I was talking about? It pushed those up to a point that it was a little concerning and limiting future flexibility. So conversation occurred, they revised that. The option that they made to revise that as opposed to scaling back on maintenance or other things within the CIP, they pushed Princess Anne High School out 10 years outside the 6-year CIP, and that's now reflected as a $499 million school facility once you take into account inflation. So let's say all that, where recently whenever they presented to City Council, direction and good conversation occurred, that I believe that they're looking to reevaluate their CIP process, their CIP projects, and they're looking to try to find a way to review everything comprehensively and make Princess Anne school replacement a priority in the earlier years rather than later years. So don't really know where that's going to go yet, but it's just a heads up to the group to stay tuned and watch that, because I think there will be future changes forthcoming with the school CIP. Also worth noting, just for full transparency and disclosure, the operating budget, when it's put together, is a time sequence. The governor's budget comes out, schools put together their budget, and then we incorporate that in the city manager's proposed budget. Then about the time we're going to print, the General Assembly amends the governor's budget, and so we're always chasing somewhere. And so one of the things that occurred in the in-between step was the crossover, or the General Assembly had allocated an additional $10 million to schools to get their ratio of unsupported, to lift the cap on positions that they were not previously supporting, went in place back in 2008. And so the General Assembly had recommended lifting that cap, which would have resulted in schools receiving an additional $10.8 million, eligible for acknowledging the localities have been funding this. This is coming back, and there's discretion in the allocation of those resources. So it's included as an estimate, and because we have to balance all the funds, we place that in the school's operating fund for review, just with a offsetting city manager reserve. In other words, there's a future decision to be made once approved by the state and how the $10.8 million are allocated and utilized. So will certainly be anything the school board adopts and proposes through a resolution will go to city council for their review and consideration to appropriate in such a manner. Revenues. I have a feeling the group might ask something about the various sources and buckets of revenue, so I'll put this slide together. This is a split of the total operating budget revenues between city and schools. So the cities here, and then the schools here for the total operating budget. I mean, obviously real estate's the largest local revenue source, but the thing I really wanted to try to get everybody's eyes on and discussion, and I figured questions might come, are state and federal revenue with decisions that are occurring and changes that are occurring at the federal level, how will it impact the city. So in terms of the city's operating budget, the city relies very little on day-to-day operations from the federal government. So $64.3 million is the total estimated federal revenue in FY26 proposed budget. Majority of that is within housing and the Department of Human Services, where there's specific grants and programs, grant funding for specific programs allocated that have federal revenue dollars tied to it. Schools, they have $104 million estimated in their proposed operating budget. A big portion of that is through their cafeteria fund, where they receive federal dollars for reduced meal, free lunches and reduced meal prices. So in terms of the overall operating budget, the federal component is relatively or fairly small compared to some of the other revenue sources. This slide is just was included in the original proposed operating budget presentation to council. Covered a lot of these. I just want to make note that in terms of the tax rate, meals from the current 5.5 to 6, the personal property pleasure boats larger than 18 feet, and then the real estate tax rates proposed to remain unchanged at 97 cents. So the biggest balancing tool of this, as the meals tax was a dedication for the CIP, the boat tax is a dedication to the CIP for coastal. The balancing of the operating budget and the general fund was really through acceptance of the organic growth generated by the 97-cent tax rate. To give a sense of the revenue growth and the amount retained, so this is a breakdown of the general fund. So year over year, the general fund revenue growth is projected to grow $78.6 million. The transfer to the schools, so schools will receive $24.4 million of that growth. Department-specific revenue, $7 million. So like VDOT revenue that they get that I mentioned for the concrete crew, that's part of that driver. But again, it's awarded for a particular reason. The boat tax transfer, the 4.3, the remaining amounts to $42.8 million. And going back a few slides, the compensation reserve at $34 million is the majority of that. There's increases in the city garage charges that I was talking about, with inflation being a driving factor of that. The disabled, elderly and disabled tax relief program, that one grew $1.5 million. $42 million goes really quickly just within those few categories. This is just a comparison of Virginia Beach with the other Hampton Roads localities in terms of tax rates. The ones that are reflected in red are the ones that we've captured based on the release of proposed budgets from the other localities. Most of them are increases with the exception of the Portsmouth one. They're proposing to keep their tax rate at $1.30 but provide a 1 cent credit larger than the previous year. It's unique. And then this is just a slide talking about the next step. So here is the next step. City Council will be receiving additional workshop presentations from various departments. We have a public hearing for you all to come out and speak and provide your input on the proposed budget at the Convention Center on April 16th. Another public hearing will occur on April 22nd. The last briefing and presentation provided to the council will be April 29th, with the reconciliation workshop to occur May 6th and the adoption May 13th, which will be 2 days before the May 15th legal deadline. That was a lot. So I don't know if everybody wants to stand up and do jumping jacks before we wake back up after, but
We've been collecting questions.
okay.
And I'm gonna come up with them.
I'm gonna get a drink.
Bar's closed.
Huh?
Yeah.
I'm Teresa Chadwick, I'm the vice chair of the Virginia Beach Tea Party. I'm gonna be handling the Q&A for all of these lovely questions. We may not get, we are a little pressed for time, it's 8:01. We're gonna do our best to get to all of them, I cannot promise. So the first question I have here, a couple of people asked about it. This has come up recently in the last couple of weeks about the food tax proposal. The food tax will break mom and pop eating places. I said, can revenue be found by cutting unnecessary spending? And why is the city increasing prepared food tax, as many families prefer eating out on special occasions such as birthdays and anniversaries? Mother's Day is coming up too, so.
And Tuesdays and Thursdays.
And it's cheaper going to Norfolk.
So in terms of the meals tax, so one of the things during the tax diversification exercise that occurred was trying to look at how Virginia Beach compares to others and what options are available, being mindful of the real estate tax rate. So City Council's been very clear of the real estate tax rate, increasing that's not an option, as that's viewed as being burdensome to Virginia Beach local residents. One of the things in terms of the meals tax, so some of the other localities within Norfolk 6.5%, Portsmouth 7.5%. So Virginia Beach would be tied for the lowest in the region. But something else about this tax that's different from the real estate is the influence of tourism. So what this tax here in this adjustment will do, it won't be all Virginia Beach residents sharing in that increased revenue generated from that meals tax increase. So it's estimated based on the consultants doing the regional tourism economic impact study that potentially up to 40% of the meals tax revenue is generated from out-of-town visitors and tourists. So the thinking with the diversification of this is it's not all necessarily on the back of Virginia Beach residents, taxpayers, and businesses.
And you speak about consultants. Another question came up. Why do we continually hire these consultants? How much have they cost this year? And why aren't these things done in-house? Yeah.
Amen.
We do a lot in-house, and we try our best to do things in-house. I can speak to my department in terms of what we have in terms of our expertise. Say that we're doing a fiscal impact on an economic development proposal. We have information on existing businesses that we can collect and projecting that out, but sometimes there's just a out of market, a new concept that I don't have the proprietary information, and my staff doesn't have the proprietary information to be able to fully evaluate and vet in terms of what the potential economic impact of that would be. that could be an example within my department in which we might need to go to an outside consultant to gather input on this, because they might have access to proprietary information we don't. That's the example I can give. I can't answer the other ones off the top of my head with consultants, but I can speak to my shop.
Okay, all right. Here's another one. Why is the city not willing to have an outside auditor to conduct a management audit and financial audit?
Ooh,
So-
good question.
So, we have the internal, city auditor's office. We do have an external audit contract that occurs annually. And so it is over, the city auditor's office manages that contract, but it is a third party, I think it's Cherry Becker, that performs the, Cherry Becker?
Becker, okay.
Yeah, they perform the external audit of the city's financials.
Why doesn't the city manager develop a revenue neutral budget and CIP?
That's a good question.
So it was an exercise that was conducted last year. There are, every year as part of the operating budget, there is a request for departments to submit service level reductions. And so it is something that's reviewed annually as a part of the budget process. And the goal and intent in trying to keep up with the direction is to not negatively impact or degrade existing services. So one thing that we're very mindful of in getting departments to achieve their reduced targets and reduced operating budget submissions and proposals are eliminating those that don't have a negative impact. So an example of libraries in this year, it was reduced librarian staff and programmatic operations within libraries that could potentially result in reduced library hours and program offerings, or reduce library administrative staff and branch coordinator positions. And the decision was made for the branch coordinator positions in an effort not to negatively impact services. It is something reviewed, but there will be a reduction in services being delivered.
Okay. The city is keeping the health premiums for employees flat for the 7th year in a row. This is going to cost $10.5 million next year. Cumulatively, it cost $60 million over the past 5 years. Why is this fair? Our property taxes went up by 50% over this time.
So, here's a very wonderful, and I typically stay away from these double axis graph. So the visualization here is the lines are the balance of the health fund. So the dotted line is schools, the solid line is the city's health fund. So you can see at one point in time, at the height of the pandemic, the combined balance between those health funds was about $72 million. Large portion of that was from employees' contributions into the health fund that accumulated due to low utilization. So they were paying into the health fund, the fund was retaining it, but they couldn't provide the services because optional procedures were not available. So it's something that accumulated, it's something we've been mindful of, but this is part of the reason as to why the employees' contributions have been able to remain flat over a period of time. But I can say, based on the projection rising healthcare costs, I can say that this is likely the last year that the gradual drawdown of this fund balance will occur, and we'll likely be back to the pre-pandemic practice of equal contribution increases of employers and employees going forward.
How does the city pick and choose which festivals to fund at the ocean front?
Yeah.
Because we don't want something in the water.
Exactly.
We
Ditto.
have enough in the water.
Really?
Yeah. So
Not everybody knows how people
there's a process. The Convention and Visitor Bureau, they have an annual ongoing contract with Ongoing, in which they program routine events. The special events that come up are typically requests or proposals that are brought forward by someone wanting to put on an event. And these are events that are selected for slotting within the weekends of the holiday or the summer months. And that's really a direction that we take guidance from City Council. City Council had the special event task force explore this and look at a process to put into place for this. But it's really, the process depends on who the event is, what weekend availability is there, and what's the anticipated draw from it.
Okay.
Is that,
How much is the taxpayer dishing out for turbine wind?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's Dominion.
Yeah, that's the
Taxpayer gonna get back.
That's in your energy bill.
Okay,
Yeah,
all
and
right.
so, with that in mind, the city has a government rate that we negotiate in with the collective of governments from Dominion. One of the things that has not taken place is we have not received what the governmental rate will be. It hasn't been finalized and negotiated. So I suspect we'll be finding out after Dominion gets an approval of which of the paths that they're gonna go in terms of their fee structuring plan, but the city's operating budget could be right there with everybody else and paying more if need be.
Dominion's asking for a 15% increase.
We'd like to know what elected officials are getting money off of that.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
Ooh.
They've already
All
increased.
recreational vehicles should not be taxed at all, and why cannot not be considered?
The recreational vehicles?
I think boats.
Boats or campers, I think, campers.
Personal property tax.
Yeah, so
State.
they are at the $1.50 rate, I believe, is the recreational personal property tax rate. So that's the personal property. I can't think off the top of my head how much that tax category generates, but it is in there. It's not at the $4 per vehicle rate that the typical vehicle is, or motorcycle or trailer, but it is a lower rate. I do know that.
Okay. How much did the salary market study cost?
I believe the direction and the allocation of that was 220,000.
What percentage of the budget is expended on paying retirement benefits to city employees, and how much does the city pay to VRS? Or you?
I got a lot of numbers in my head, but I do not have that exact number off the top of my head. I can get that.
The
So,
percentage is 18.98% of salaries,
right,
but we could get the dollar amount and email it to you. It's a lot.
yeah.
Okay, email, any of the unanswered questions,
We can
just
answer.
email them back over to us. We'll have Diana put it out in an email to everyone.
Okay, yes,
That
okay.
was my question, so maybe I didn't state it clearly. Of that whole pie chart, of that $2.7 billion, how much of that expense, school board and city workers, is going to pay for retirement benefits of people who were former city employees? What percentage of our overall expenses go to people who are not working for us anymore?
Yeah, so, okay. I understand that question. So the budgeted allocation each year as part of our operating budget is a percentage of the existing payroll occurring. We're paying in for the existing workforce that's there now. The payment, and we're paying that to the state, the Virginia Retirement System. And then,
VRS.
right, and then it goes there. The payment from the VRS pension plan and pension fund to the city's retirees or retired workforce is coming directly from the VRS pension plan fund that's managed by the state.
Right. So that total amount of money, you've got a $2.7 billion annual expense, school board and city. what's the total amount of that money that comes back to our former city employees out of the VRS this year?
It's not in our $2.8 billion budget. It's not appropriated by us to give to them. It's a direct payment from the state to them.
It's zero. Of the 2.8 billion, it's zero.
No, we pay into the VRS to cover that
Right.
from the Virginia Beach taxpayers. And there's this growing amount of money that we now are obligated to for the ever-growing number of retirees. That money is not fully funded. So what percentage of that, okay.
I can just say that how much we pay annually is roughly 18% of our current workforce payroll.
Okay, and the payroll is what percentage of the overall expense of the budget?
I've got $400 million in my head for the city, and she's calculating.
So half.
It's 119, something like 119.
I can't type fast enough.
The young generation.
About 59.
So in terms of, so the split between the operating accounts and the personnel, 59% of the operating budget is for pay and benefits, or just salaries?
Pay and benefits.
Pay and benefits.
For city and school, it's combined.
That's FICA, FICA Med, health, all the benefits.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we are out of time. I'm gonna hand the rest of the questions over to Diana and we can get them answered in email, or?
Yeah, why don't you give him the questions,
Okay,
and then he can email them back over to us.
okay.
And, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, yay.
Hey, before we wrap it up, we're gonna do our 50-50. If you haven't done the 50-50 raffle, now's a good time to cash in.